Hi, today I'm going to show you how to create a simple calculator using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. By the way, I'll be putting the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in just one file. Not going to separate them. So let's start. I'm using VS Code for this. So first, we got to construct our HTML structure. Since I want to save some time and effort, I'm going to just Control, Shift, exclamation point, then gotta punch that enter. And voila. We now have our HTML structure. Oh, and let me add our direction attribute here to ensure proper text rendering and layout on the web page. It's important for languages that are written in red from right to left, such as Arabic, Hebrew, and others, but since we're using English here, we'll use the value LTR, or left to right. For languages that are left to right, setting DIR, or direction, to LTR explicitly might not be necessary as it's the default direction for HTML. However, it can still be used for clarity or to override certain settings. Next, let's change our title. Let's say simple calculator using HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Now let's move on to the main part. This project utilizes a table element to establish the framework of the calculator. Within this table, 5 rows delineate the calculator into 5 horizontal sections. Each of these rows is denoted by a table row or TR element. Inside each TR element, there are table data or TD elements that house the calculator's display screen and buttons. First, we'll begin with the table tag, adding a class for that design. Let's call it calculator for now. Don't worry about it yet. Its importance will become clear later. This initial row will serve as a display area of our calculator, where inputs and outputs will be showcased. Okay, here's our table row tag and the TR, and inside it are TD tags that will contain the actual data cells. For table data of our first row, we're gonna add colspan attribute and put a value of 3 to specify that this cell should occupy the space of 3 regular cells horizontally, since we need some width for our display. Inside the first table data will be the input element. This element is used to create various types of input fields that allow users to enter data or interact with a web page. Then we are going to assign class here. The class attribute assigns the CSS class display box to the input element, and classes are used in HTML and CSS to apply specific styling or formatting to elements. In this case, the display box class likely contains styles that determine the appearance of this input field. Next, we'll put our type attribute. The type attribute specifies the type of input field. In this case, it's set to text, indicating that this input field will accept text input. Of course, we need to put our ID attribute, let's say result. IDs are commonly used to target the specific elements using JavaScript or CSS for manipulation or styling. Last is to put disabled here. The disabled attribute is a Boolean attribute that, when present, disables the input field. This means the user cannot interact with it. They cannot enter or modify any content with this input field. Now let's check our file if there's a difference. Refresh, and there we could see a rectangular box. Now we are going to proceed to our second table data of our first row. Fourth technically. So it is a table cell for the clear screen, and its type is button with a value C, shortcut for clear screen, and it has onClick clear screen. So this attribute specifies an event handler. So when the button is clicked, it triggers a JavaScript function named clearScreen. The onClick attribute essentially defines the action to be taken when the button is clicked. And we are going to set ID to btn, or shortcut for button, and this attribute assigns an identifier to btn of the button element. This ID can be used to target and manipulate this specific element using JavaScript or CSS. Now let's see if there's any changes. And here you could see our C button, or the clear button. Heading to our second TR, or table row, this row holds the first three numbers and the operation of the calculator. Of course, we gotta add our input tag and set its type to button and value to 1, since 1 is the first number in our calculator. So in simple terms, the code creates a button labeled 1 within a table cell. So when this button is clicked, it triggers a function called display with the argument 1. So I gotta copy this table data to save more time and effort for our next table data. Since we have 4 TDs in this second table row, we gotta paste 3 TDs. Now let's change their values and the display for 2 and display 2, for value 3 and display 3, and for the last, it's supposed to be an operation or division, the backslash, and there. Refresh, and that's our first and second row of our calculator. Back to our code, we'll be heading to our third table row, or TR. Just gonna copy this to save time and effort. This now is our third table row, and I'm gonna just change the values, also the argument of the display. Since the last value of the second row is 3, our next is 4, then 5, 6, and then the last input is our operation subtraction and argument subtraction also. So now let's check the changes. Refresh, and that's our third table row. For our fourth row, we gotta paste again what we copied earlier and change their values, also the display's argument. Last number is 6, so we are going to start here. 7, then 8, 9, and change their argument display. And last is the operation. Here we'll have the addition. Gotta check the changes again and refresh. And that's our fourth row. Now let's head to our fifth row, the last row, since our calculator only contains 5 rows. And gotta paste again what we have copied earlier. Change the values again. Our first table data will be the dot for decimal, or the point, and our second will be the 0. For our third, there will be changes on the value of, since this is the equal button, its role is to display the calculation result. We'll assign it the function name calculate to separate its action from the other buttons. This distinction will become clear when we run some JavaScript later on. So we'll use the ID PDN here to target and manipulate this specific element later. For our last button, the button for multiplication, it has the same function with the other numbers and operation, which is display. So you gotta change the value and the argument of the display. Now we are finished na sa on our HTML structure. Let's check the changes, and that's our 5th row. Next will be we'll put aestheticness on our calculator so it would not seem like a planned calculator using CSS. Let's start our style tag here, where we are gonna house our CSS. First, we'll apply CSS to the class calculator. So we could see here that the table tag contains the class calculator. This means that the presence of the calculator class within the table tag means that any changes made to this class will affect all elements nested within the table. Setting the padding to 10px adds space between the content and the border of an element. And gotta add a border radius here of 1 em, which will create a rounded outline around the element with the radius matching the element's font size. Check the changes, and that's the padding and border radius. Next, we'll add the height and set it into 380px. Also the width to 400px. And the margin will be set to auto. Next is the background color. We'll use hexadecimal code color. And let's make it like a dark bluish gray color. Say hashtag 191b28. Last is for our box shadow. So box shadow property applies to shadows to an element. And we're using here RGBA 0.9. 0px, 10px, 20px. This is the first shadow. Breaking it down, this defines the color of first shadow using RGBA values, red, green, blue, alpha. In this case, it's mostly black color with 19% opacity. And the 0px, 10px, 20px, these values represent the horizontal offset, 0px, vertical offset, 10px, and blur radius, 20px of this shadow. For the second shadow, we're going to use RGBA again with value 0.23. This defines the color of the second shadow using RGBA values. It's also a mostly black color but with slightly more opacity at 23%. And the 0px, 6px, 6px, these values represent the horizontal offset, vertical offset, and blur radius of the shadow, respectively. Let's check the changes, refresh. That's a lot of changes. Next is we are going to manipulate the HTML element with the class display box, and we could see that all inputs here do have class display box. So in short, we are going to manipulate our input. Let's start with the font family. So this specifies the font family for the inside text of the display box element. And here we are going to assign Orbitron sans serif it prioritizes the Arbitron font and falls back to a generic sans serif font if Arbitron isn't available. And for our background color, we'll set hexadecimal color. Let's say a light purplish gray color defined like hashtag DC DP1. For our border, gonna set it to solid black with 0.5 px thick and color to block also with border radius of 5px. Check the changes, and that's our calculator as of now. Now let's put some changes on displays backs height and width, since it's a little bit awkward, too small. Let's say the width is 100px, percent, and for height, set it to 65%. Check the changes. Now the display box is larger and wider. Okay, let's add more colors to the mix. Remember, we assigned the BD and ID to the inputs featuring the equal sign and the C for clearing the screen. So this line of code sets the background color of the element with the ID BDN to a bright pinkish color defined by the... let me change it. Just a sec. There. Bright pinkish defined by sharp FF00A6. Now let's check the changes. Refresh, and our two buttons are pink. Next. So this block of CSS code targets all input elements with a type attribute set to button and applies specific styles to them. For our font family, Arbitron sans serif, like earlier, this line sets the font family of these buttons to Arbitron, and if font isn't available, it defaults to a generic sans serif font. In our background color, we use RGB. So this property sets background color of these buttons to RGB color defined by values 83, 85, 16, resulting in a specific shade of green. Next, we're gonna put assign white to our color. So this sets the text color of these buttons to white. And for border, we'll have solid black with 0.5 px thick, and this line creates a black border around these buttons with a thickness of 5 pixels. And width of 100%, this makes the buttons span the entire width of their container. Border radius is 5px, and this property rounds the corner of the buttons, giving them a slightly curved appearance with a border radius of 5 pixels. For our height, let's set it to 70%. So to allow them to occupy a significant portion of the available vertical space. And outline, let's make it none. To remove the default outline that appears around the button when they are clicked, enhancing the visual appearance. Now let's check for any changes, refresh, and that's our calculator. Next, we'll apply CSS to input active type equals button. So this CSS selector targets an actively clicked input element, specifically when its type attribute is set to button. Now let's set the background to something like gray shade. So this changes the background and color of the button. when it's actively being clicked. Using hexadecimal here, sharp E5, E5, E5. Then we'll put WebKit box shadow. Inset 0px, 0px, 5px, sharp C1, C1, C1. So this line applies a box shadow effect with an inset shadow of 5 pixels, 5px, in a light gray color, the C1, 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 and around the button when it's active. So the WebKit box shadow property is specific for older version of WebKit-based browsers. Next is the mouse box shadow. So similar to the previous line, this applies an inset box shadow effect around the button when it's actively clicked, specifically for older version of Mozilla-based browser. So let's set it to inset 0px, 0px, 5px. I'm just gonna copy this and paste. And last is the back shadow. We'll put the value inset 0px, 0px, 5px, and again sharp C1, C1, C1. So this sets an inset box shadow effect around the button when it's active with a shadow of 5 pixels or px and a light gray color, the C1, C1, C1. There are some errors, and oh, we forget our semicolon. That's it. Now let's check for any changes. I refresh. That's still, it seems the same, but there's some differences. And finally, we'll add JavaScript to make our calculator functional. And of course, we're gonna use the script tag since we're using JavaScript. So the script tag in HTML is used to define a client-side JavaScript with an HTML document. So it allows you to embed references JavaScript code directly within the HTML file. So a function clear screen. This line declares the start of a JavaScript function named clearScreen. So remember, we assigned clearScreen to one of the input with the value of C, right? So here we're going to put the document that get by element by ID, result that value. So within the function, this line targets an element with the ID result in the HTML document, and it sets the value property of that element to an empty string. So document.getElementById result uses getElementById to find an element in the HTML with the ID result. And the .value equals empty string assigns an empty string as the value of that element. For our second function, this will be the display value. And this function takes a parameter value and appends it to the current value of the HTML element with the ID result. And it is used to display and concatenate values on the calculator's screen. The .value, this access the value property of the selected element. For input elements, the value property represents the current value typed or displayed within that element. And the addition and equal value, this is a shorthand notation for appending a value to the existing value of the selected element. So it adds the value passed as an argument to the existing value of the result element. And for our third function or last function named calculate, remember again that we assigned calculate on click attribute in one of the input, which is the equal, as the value equal. So this function retrieves the current value displayed in the HTML element with the ID result and stores it in the variable p. Then it uses the eval function to evaluate the mathematical expression contained in p. After evaluation, the result is stored in the variable q. Then the content of the HTML element with the ID result is updated to display the calculated result q. Now this is our code for JavaScript, and let's try our calculator if it's gonna function. Let's say 3 plus 3 equals 6. That's right. Let's try subtraction. 3 minus 3, 0. That's right, that's clear. And 3 divided by 3, which is 1. And that's correct. Last is the multiplication, 3 times 3, 9. And that's right. And so we could conclude that our calculator is working. Thanks for watching.